All right, welcome everyone to our Georgia question and answer live stream. We're going to be just sitting here for a while, probably talking about the our article that we wrote on the election runoff in Georgia, anything related to Georgia at all. Also, just general political news if you want to go over that, and also our coverage, our live stream that we're going to be doing tomorrow
Yeah.
for the Georgia runoff races. These are two really important races for the composition of the Senate. There's a lot of stuff riding on these races, and so we feel it's important to kind of not only throw our prediction out there and make it clear where we stand, where we think things are going, but also explain why we did this, what we think the possibilities are for different outcomes, and also our plans for election coverage, because we will be doing election coverage.
Yeah.
For the
I'll
Georgia
go over that
races.
towards the end with the election stuff after this.
Yeah.
Basically,
But yeah,
what Eric said, just drop your questions in the comments. We'll be answering those about most likely relating to our rating or the article with it. But we're also, I'll talk later on about our plans for coverage on Tuesday and for the rest of this election cycle as we change over to 2021. And we'll also have a few hints about 2022 if we get asked about that.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, so I guess we'll be here just kind of chilling around and talking, and when you ask questions, we'll be ready to answer them. Obviously they can relate to our article we've written today. If you've not already seen it, it's the first article when you go to electionsdaily.com or elections-daily.com. But it explains our rationale. We've moved the races to leans Republican. We think that Republicans are narrowly favored in both of these contests, and we think there are good reasons as to why we've made this decision. But there's obviously plenty of debate going on around the election, around what the state of things are looking at the moment, and so we're definitely looking forward to talking about it and to finally ending the 2020 elections, kind of putting the last hammer or last nail, if you want to call that, into.
It's going to be over. Although I think it's better to say nail in the coffin than cherry on top, because I think all of us want this election cycle to be over.
Yeah, and by default, this is the last trace basically of 2020. So we're kind of ready to just get on past it, focus ahead to 2021, where we've got some interesting races in Virginia. We've got races there, including for the governor, attorney general, House of Delegates races, Senate races there, and also in New Jersey, which is Harrison's home state. And so we're obviously really excited to go over that as well. So
I did link the article. If you guys haven't read it, it's in the comments, and I linked it. So again, please leave your comments there. We have 11 people watching. If any of you have any comments or questions for us, just post a comment in the YouTube chat box, and you should it'll pop up and we'll be able to address it for you.
So I'll kind of go ahead and get started. We don't have any questions yet, but I'll go ahead and get started on kind of our thought process here. So before the election, we did our initial race ratings. We rated all of the elections in the country, the federal presidential elections, as well as the Senate and House races. And we made those projections. We predicted in these two events, we said that Purdue was favored. We had an unusual rating in the Georgia or the regular election. We said that Purdue is favored in that race, but that the odds of a runoff and an Ossoff win, so the odds of basically either going to runoff or Ossoff winning, were higher than 50%. We just thought Purdue's win was the most likely of the outcomes. It turned out the race did go to a runoff. Obviously, that Purdue won that race. If you look at the popular vote, he finished he did very well in that. He finished with a similar margin to Tom Tillis in the election in North Carolina, the North Carolina Senate race. He won that by around 2% over John Ossoff, but he did not get the 50% of the vote needed to avert a runoff. So what that means is that this race is going to what we call a runoff election. Georgia's really weird in that regard, but this is something that has happened before. It happened in 2008, where the Republican finished ahead of the Democratic candidate in Georgia, but he didn't get enough of the vote in order to secure a majority. So what happened is it went to
that was a more traditional runoff back in 2008 when you had Chambliss versus Martin, and it went to election night. And I wouldn't compare this runoff to that runoff at all, because that runoff essentially you saw a drop off in Democratic turnout in the runoff, which is normally what you do see in a runoff in Georgia. It's between a Republican and a Democrat. The Republican typically improves their margin in the runoff, but this time around, no, I think it's going to be a fight to the death. strong turnout by both parties. It's going to come down to a close clash that really redefines what a Georgia runoff has been.
Yeah. The other interesting one I want to show is the Georgia, the Senate special election. I posted this map on Twitter a few days ago on the Elections Daily account. And as you can see here, Republicans actually, against expectations, finished a point ahead of the Democrats in the 2020 special election. Most polls showed Warnock around 40% of the vote in the primary, which was a jungle primary. So if nobody got 50% of the vote plus one, then it would go to a runoff. Well, Warnock did clear that field. He finished ahead of everyone else in that field. He didn't get the percentage of the vote needed to do that. And actually, he finished with only around in the 30s. Part of this was because pollsters kind of overestimated his performance compared to other Democrats. Another Democrat, Barbara Jackson, gained a substantial portion of the vote. But Republicans, as you can see here, actually finished ahead of Democrats, even as Trump lost Georgia. And if you kind of look here, the two Republicans in the race were Kelly Loeffler, the incumbent senator who was appointed to the Senate by Governor Brian Kemp, also a Republican, and Doug Collins, who's the representative from Georgia's 9th congressional district. So Loeffler finished with around 26% of the vote.
Anymore, but...
Yeah. Well, Collins finished with around 20% of the vote. That's about 6% for Loeffler. Now, if you look at this right here, you can see where Collins overperformed. He overperformed in two areas. Around the around his 9th congressional district, northeastern Georgia. This is one of the most Republican areas of the state and of the country, to be frank. And also scatterings of southern Georgia, especially this portion around here. I don't think this is a specific geographic region. It just he happened to do better here. And Loeffler did better everywhere else. So she actually did very well in the Atlanta area compared to Collins. This is a map that Krasgrenitz put out. Warnock finished with 33% of the vote. Loeffler finished with 26%. Collins finished with 20%. And another Democrat, Barbara Jackson, finished with 7%. There were additional votes for people like Matt Lieberman. And I think Jackson did win a few precincts out in rural Georgia where there's a lot of voters who don't necessarily pay attention to national television. But as you can see here, Warnock finished with a lead in a lot of counties, and he had the lead going into the runoff itself. Out of the results here, the most likely result we see from these elections is a narrow win for both for Perdue and for Loeffler. They actually aren't the incumbent senators at this point, as since the election is still ongoing and Congress just swore in its new members, those seats are actually vacant technically right now, and will not be seated until the election is over. So they're actually, as of now, former senators, Perdue and Loeffler. We predict that both of them, though, will have enough support to win the election narrowly. And additionally, we think that the second most likely scenario is probably a split decision or a Democratic win. I think Harrison wanted to add something here, so I'll go ahead and let him do that.
I was just going to talk about, the whole point of this is really to just reiterate or explain what the article said in terms of our justification for these lean R ratings. And to be brief, and I did a tweet on this last night, essentially what the argument we make is from what we've heard from our sources, and Krasgrenitz was the one who really noted this. When we're looking at the turnout factor here. So right now, when you count the total Democratic lead among votes that have already been returned in terms of VBM early vote and in-person early vote, the Democratic lead that we've heard is around D+8 to D+10, either a little under or a little over that, but most likely closer to the D+10 range. We respect, and Kraz wanted me to add this, we do respect other models that have shown higher leads right now. So, we have something like D+13 is the Nate Cohn model, which would be virtually impossible for Republicans to overcome. But essentially our argument is election day turnout should be enough to save Republicans, because if they net that 1.4 million votes or so needed to overcome a 10% Democratic lead in pre-election votes, then we estimate that will be enough for them to win both runoffs. And on top of that, the other aspect of our argument that we noted, and even someone like Kyle Kondik at Chris Babala said something similar, is that we just expect election day vote to make up a slightly higher percentage of the total electorate than it did back in November. So what that means is essentially we're looking at anywhere from 22% of the total electorate to 25% really at the max composed of election day votes, which is about 5% more than the 20% we had in November. And to clear up the last question really about that, just because more of the votes are cast in person on election day, we're not saying that we expect higher turnout. That's improbable. Even though there are around 150,000 new voters that didn't vote in November that have voted this time, we don't expect turnout to be higher than it was in November because it's not associated with the presidential contest.
And one thing I want to clarify here is that obviously we've given other scenarios in our article that we wrote that would be potentially different results for the election if these were to go on. So obviously, like Harrison mentioned, if there is indeed a Democratic plus 12 advantage, Republicans would need approximately 1.7 million voters to overcome the Condic model, or not the Condic, uh, the
Oh,
the cone model. Yes.
oh, no.
And keep in mind, we're talking models here. Georgia doesn't have party registration, so we're going off of racial demographics. We're comparing to polls, all sorts of other things. But there's not.
Educational
Yeah.
weighting too. I know Cohn's model takes into effect. Cohn's model is different from the other ones in that it takes racial demographics into account as well, not just educational weighting and weighting by assumed partisanship.
Yeah, absolutely. And so that's one part here. But if it is indeed that high, Republicans would need about 1.7 million votes on election day, and we think 1.5 million is certainly possible. We've heard that number actually thrown around by multiple sources. We can't mention the sources' names. That's just typical journalistic practice, but we have heard it thrown around. But 1.7 million is just way too high. We don't think that's feasible at all. So that's kind of the point where, if that is the case, that'd be one area where our prediction would fail.
Quickly, I want to just address two things that were brought up in the comments here. So, first off, and I meant to say this to Eric earlier, but I didn't want to interrupt you.
Yeah,
Since,
sorry.
Purdue's seat is Class 2, and Class 2, the term ended only for the Class 2 senators. So, what Eric was meaning to say is that only Purdue's seat is vacant because the Class 2 senators, they just swore in again. But Loeffler's term, after the special election, Loeffler's appointed to the Class 3 seat, which isn't up again until 2022.
Yeah, and that's why what we're talking about is one thing that mentioned. I'm sorry, I goofed there. Is whether or not David Perdue would be the senior senator from Georgia if he wins. He's obviously been in the Senate for a term already, but since the seat is technically vacant, we're not actually sure whether or not he would qualify as the senior senator anymore, because Loeffler is still in office right now. So
And our
that's
second
one scenario
question
here.
from Brian Elections, and it relates to what is the most
Mhm.
likely split decision. So just for the viewers, I'm sure you all know, but basically split decision means that there's a ticket split essentially between the runoffs, in that
Yeah.
one of the seats goes to the Democrats and one goes to the Republicans. And another person in the comments has said that they predict a Purdue-Warnock split. But for you, Eric, do you have any other things that you would want to add in terms of what you perceive to be the most likely split?
Yeah, so I actually don't think either split would be that impossible. So basically, what we're talking about when we're talking about a split is obviously there's only a few combinations that you can have here for what would be. It would be Purdue Warnock, so Republicans win, or sorry, the first is that Republicans win both. The second is that Democrats win both, and then the other two options are Purdue Warnock, Purdue Ossoff, or no, sorry, Purdue Warnock, or what's her name, Loeffler Ossoff. Out of those, Loeffler Ossoff seems the least likely. Purdue performed better than Loeffler did, and Republicans did on his side of the ball. So we don't think that's the most likely scenario, but it could be a possibility if you have a bunch of African American voters in Atlanta who are going out and voting for Warnock, but they're not voting for Ossoff, or you have a bunch of voters in Marjorie Taylor Greene's seat that went out there and voted for Loeffler because she said so,
Yeah.
and didn't vote for
Yeah.
Purdue. That would be the scenario there. But we see that as less likely than the more likely one, which is that Purdue has more appeal in Atlanta. And because of the appeal in Atlanta, he narrowly wins, while Warnock narrowly wins, thanks to his appeal with African American voters.
I would agree with that personally. I think, well, first off, let me just say that in my personal opinion, I think it's more likely that both seats vote for one party. So
Yes.
I would rank, obviously, with our rating that we're looking at number one, 2 Republicans elected, or after that, 2 Democrats elected. But if we're going to number 3, the third most likely, I would agree, is a Purdue Warnock type scenario. But just to add on to that, it'll be interesting to see the undervote between the Senate races, and if we can break that undervote down by region, because I would expect that there will be some kind of an undervote, at least minor, between the Senate races in the Atlanta metro area when we look at heavily African-American precincts. It's potential. I mean, we have no idea at this point, but it'll just be interesting to break down the results afterwards. But I'm going to move on to the next question in the comments. What are the chances we know the winners on election night? Any insights into the timeline of vote returns? So I don't know the specifics about the timeline of vote returns, but if Georgia's told us anything, and if the other states that have been close have told us anything from the last election 2 months ago, I would say no, we probably won't. If these races are close, it'll come down to the last vote. And our current expectations have, like we said, about 75% of the votes that are cast in this election are going to be cast either via in-person early voting or by mail-in early voting, and only about 25% at the max are probably going to be cast on election day. But just remember, it was about an 80-20 split in terms of pre-election day vote and on election day vote back in 2020. So Eric can add on to this if he wants, but I really don't expect the winners to be known on election night. I don't think.
I mean, it really depends on whether or not some of these scenarios pop out. If there's that Democrat plus 13 scenario, then we may know that on election night. If the Republican turnout, on the other hand, is something like 1.7 million, 1.5 million, we might know on election night. Those are really high numbers. 1.5 million in particular seems to be the number that's kind of thrown around as if that happens, Republicans almost surely have it in the bag. We think they could win with around 1.2 or 1.3 million for comparison here, for going off of kind of the model that was laid out by Nate Cohn. But I think it's definitely possible we won't know, and I think that's deeply unfortunate, especially given the unfortunate and dubious claims that have been put out by people about these Georgia elections, which are frankly dishonest and wrong.
Yeah,
because these elections, these are the most scrutinized. Georgia's presidential race has been the most scrutinized and examined presidential contest at a state level since probably Florida in 2000. There have been recount after recount after recount, hand ballots, risk audits. They just looked at votes in Cobb County. The results are clear. The result was very clear from Georgia, and we're hoping that we're not going to have a repeat of some of the conspiracy theories next time.
Yeah, we're going to move on because we have a lot of new questions to address. So just real quick here, when did they start tabulating the mail-in votes? Well, they already have been. There's been a consistent tabulation going on. They pretty much tabulate them as they come in. That's how Nate Cohn is essentially able, and all these other models, to tabulate essentially how the race is going when we look at the mail-in votes so far. And again, there are two categories. There are in-person early votes and mail-in early votes. And overall, like I said, those are probably going to make up at the maximum like 80% of the total votes cast in this election. 20% or so will probably be cast on election day. And Philip, that should answer your other question here as well when we relate that back to the general election. I would say it's still going to be pretty similar. There may be some variance, but I would say the split between election day and pre-election is going to be rather similar.
Yeah.
I just wanted to clarify here this question. I wasn't paying that much attention to what Eric said, but I think what Eric was trying to reiterate is not that Purdue would have somehow more black support than
no, it would be suburban white.
I think he was basically trying to say that there would be voters in black precincts that would turn out for Warnock that wouldn't turn out for Ossoff. And on top of that, I think what he meant to say was in the Georgia suburbs where we saw Purdue outrunning Trump with white voters, that some of those voters may break for Purdue at a greater rate than they would break for Loeffler when we were talking about the split. But I think is that what you meant, Eric?
Yeah. I'm trying to pull up the map for Miles. Let me pull this out. He did a map on the Georgia, specifically the Atlanta area. But if you look at the vote totals, there was a tremendous number of voters in urban Atlanta, what you call the more African-American areas of Atlanta, that went out and voted for Joe Biden, but did not vote for Jon Ossoff. Jon Ossoff finished with fewer votes by about 100,000 fewer votes than Biden, if I'm recalling correctly, which is a big number. And you can kind of clearly look at that if you look at the performance from these candidates in Metro Atlanta. So those basically would be a combination of suburban white voters from around Atlanta. Keep in mind that Atlanta itself is a small city. It's not huge. When we talk about Atlanta, we're talking about the broader metropolis area. So yes, basically, if you look at it that way, I think it could be quite probable that some voters would go out and vote for Raphael Warnock, but not really care about Jon Ossoff. Obviously, Democrats would like for both candidates to be voted for, but if you look at just history, it's not impossible to see otherwise. And most of the race has revolved around attacks between Loeffler and Warnock. Another thing to deal with around here, obviously, is the 14th congressional district is really lagging behind for Republicans in turnout. That's one reason people are pretty confident the Republicans are going to turn out fairly strong on election day. The question is how much. The lower end model has around 850,000, which again we're skeptical of. The higher end is 1.5 million, which we're also skeptical of. Although the people that have given us that number were pretty dead on pre-election in terms of the early voting totals. And we think it's somewhere in the middle. And you average that out, we're hedging our bets on the Republicans here, to be sure.
Yeah, so I was just looking up. Sorry, I was going to answer a new question. I misunderstood Philip's question earlier. So we'll get to that in a second. But first, we have a question from Evan Hunt in the comments. Do you think today's news about Trump and the Georgia Secretary of State, Brad Raffensperger, changes the dynamics of these races? Or do you think the electorate will be too polarized? So I guess I'll just add in a little thing about this too. Honestly, I think that we're at the height of polarization right now. I mean, I'll tie this into another question because someone was talking about the scandal relating to Warnock running over his wife's foot, which has been touted by Republicans in the races now for the last few weeks. At the end of the day, I don't think it matters because the Republicans held that attack till essentially the end of the campaign when they could have released it earlier on. So when we relate that back to an issue like this, what we heard with Trump and Raffensperger ultimately having to hang up on President Trump, I think I would say yes. Polarization simply is too much to overcome at this point. Voters are energized. Democrats are definitely energized to win the Senate and flip both races, and we have plenty of Republicans too, even if they haven't shown themselves in the data yet, that will want to secure the Senate. So I would say the big thing to watch in terms of Trump relating to this race is the rally that Trump's going to do pre-election tomorrow. I think that's going to play a big role. We'll see what Trump does and how that ultimately affects the race. Because at the end of the day, he'll have a big sway among those Republican voters, many of whom are in districts like the 14th, which are currently lagging in turnout, as Eric mentioned.
And one other thing I want to mention here, obviously, is that the big fear with that, obviously, is not that Trump is going to, is that the Twitter stuff. Twitter is not real life. Most voters probably don't care about this video. But the possibility that Trump goes crazy during the rally. It's worth noting, however, that within his rallies, Trump has actually been fairly composed in terms of the message of getting out the vote. He's not the first rally that was held in Georgia or that was held after the election actually was pretty laser focused on it. So it's very possible he could be very angry and going a long rant about him, about the Secretary of State, but the point of this is to reelect Loeffler and Collins, and I think Loeffler and Perdue, and so I think that it's going to be a little bit more, it's going to be a little bit more tame than some might think. I don't think he's going to be telling people to boycott the race or anything.
So I wanted to readdress Philip's question because if I just went on the election project and calculated the numbers for sure to address it properly. But his question was, sorry, I wasn't clear. Of the mail-in ballots that have been requested and returned, what share have been returned, and how does that compare with the general election? So currently looking at the data, and this is just mail-in ballots, so early mail-in ballots. This does not include early in-person voting, which is also a thing, but accounts for a much smaller amount of the total votes cast. So we're looking at mail-in ballots that have been returned and accepted. Currently, 69.7% of the ballots have been returned in terms of the requested ballots. That's 957,544 ballots. And in November, 74% of the ballots in terms of mail-in ballots were returned and accepted. So we haven't exceeded November yet, and I don't expect we will. But just for the math here, if we're looking at the number of returned ballots in this election in terms of what percentage of the number of returned ballots this time are of the general election, 72.5% is what came out of that. So essentially, we're 72% of the general election electorate in terms of return mail-in ballots. So I hope that answers your question. And I guess I'll also touch in-person early voting compared against the general election. In-person early voting right now, 27% of registered voters have voted in person early, and combined early vote total right now is at about 39%. But again, this has to be updated because they haven't finished counting all the mail-ins that have come in at this point. So that's not counting as in counting the winners. That's just in terms of receiving the ballots, in terms of which ones are received or rejected. All right. Let's see. Let's look. Sorry. We're going to get to all the questions. Sorry about that.
Yeah. We got a lot of questions actually coming through now.
Next one's from Oscar Lover 100. Says, how different would the data be right now of Georgia registered voters by party?
Well, think about it this way. I want to actually mention something real quick, is that before the North Carolina election, North Carolina was counting voters by party. And so we were actually able to look through the early voting returns and figure out how many people had turned out, what would roughly need to happen. We ultimately blew it on North Carolina. I'm kicking myself over that we did not get what was going on there. And we called it, said that Biden would probably win it. But if looking in hindsight at those numbers, there's actually a lot of stuff there that tipped off the result of the election that we don't know here. Like in North Carolina, Georgia is going to need a big election day turnout for Republicans, and that's going to need to go mostly to the Republican Party. That's basically all we can say from these results we know at this point. I think the question is just how much of that early vote was Democratic and how many voters will turn out on election day. I want to go to one here, which is a good question here, which is I don't know how far through we were on these things, but there's multiple questions here. This is one thing right here, question from Jordy Pons. Have you considered the possibility that Dem early vote turnout is lagging throughout the state as in all runoffs? 20% of Fulton, DeKalb who haven't voted early compared to general are not Republicans. I wouldn't say there's a lot of evidence that early vote turnout is lagging per se. I mean, Democrats seem pretty impressed with what they're going on. Keep in mind that the vote totals in this runoff aren't going to equal the presidential turnout. I think that's generally agreed upon, that the turnout will be slightly lower, at least, than the presidential. So you have to count a little bit for that. I do know that from some of these areas in Atlanta area have been turning out like crazy early voting, especially areas that have been worked on and targeted by Atlanta area Democrats. So sorry if that didn't answer the question completely, but I mean, it seems to me like Democrats are pleased with their early voting results to me.
And I mean, I think another thing that's just come into this, I mean, if you look at the, I'm trying to find the data right now. I can't find it. But basically, if you look at the turnout by early vote by congressional district, the congressional districts south of the metro Atlanta area obviously have higher turnout than districts like the 14th, which are more Republican and have made up, if you look at the counties in the 14th, essentially the lowest rate of requests for mail-in ballots. I mean, most of these counties just simply make up only a minute fraction of the total number of mail-in ballots requested, according to the State Board of Elections, which is now fuddled its data through the U.S. Elections Project. Like, if we look at mail-in ballot requests, let me just share my screen real quick, because this is kind of what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, that'd probably be a good idea.
Yeah, let me try this. All right. This is mail-in ballot requests by registered voters here. So, I mean, even here you can see DeKalb County, and then you go up to a county like, for example, Whitfield County in the 14th, just nothing. So, I mean, I think we're just going to have to wait and see. Move on. Can you talk more about the Savannah region? So, I actually have a cool map of the Savannah region that my friend Armin Thomas made. And I'm going to pull that up real quick, Eric, but if you want to say anything in the meantime while I find that.
So, yeah, Savannah is actually interesting in that it anchors one of the congressional districts, which isn't technically closer than places like the 11th district. It's the 1st district, which is anchored by, I believe, Buddy Carter is the representative there. And it kind of stretches down from Savannah along the entire coast. Obviously, Savannah is a more Democratic city in terms of it's one of the few Democratic bastions at this point in South Georgia. If you kind of look at the presidential results there, look at the Senate election results, it's a pretty solidly blue county. Although it's not necessarily as blue as even Augusta. I think long term, we had an excellent article that was written earlier in the year on the Augusta area as kind of the bellwether of Georgia. From I believe it was Paul McCreary who wrote it. I would recommend looking that up about Augusta. But Savannah as a whole, obviously, it is crucial for Republican efforts to get out the vote, and the whole area, the surroundings, and it's one of the more like a lot of South Georgia, it's racially polarized in terms of voting.
It's very inelastic overall, Southeast Georgia, but I have the map that I found for coastal Georgia.
Yeah, so that's why the Buddy Carter seat is so really stable, even though it's only like a Republican plus 10 seat, the margin never shifts.
Here's the map, and again, this is just coastal Georgia, so this is not the entire Buddy Carter seat. But if we look at this is the most swingy part of the Buddy Carter seat, mostly because it includes Liberty County and, of course, Chatham County, which is the home of Savannah. But essentially, if you're looking at these 6 counties, we're going to be looking at this on election night. But Joe Biden won the coastal district swing area in Georgia, as Thorngill calls it on Twitter. So I would be looking at this for both runoffs and seeing, are the Democrats winning there? And is their margin greater or less than, or just about where Biden's was? Because if so, then that could lead to a Democratic victory. But if they're not there, and again, we want to hit all the strings here, all strings attached. So it is possible, depending on the turnout differential and how the electorate changes, that it may not be the best idea to compare it directly 100% with the presidential race. But if the Democratic Senate nominees in the runoffs aren't winning this region, given that Biden won it by 2 points, that's probably a very bad sign.
Yeah, yeah. Keep in mind that that Chatham County in Georgia, it gave its highest portions for a Democratic candidate since I believe FDR. 59% of the vote or so went to Joe
Yeah.
Biden compared to about 40% for Trump. That's almost the threshold of. I mean, that's almost a 20-point threshold, which is a pretty big deal. This is a relatively mid-sized area. It's not a huge city. 290,000 people or so. Pretty good amount. So obviously for turnout, it's going to matter. The region as a whole, though, is fairly inelastic. It did shift a little bit, like a lot of coastal regions did. But Democrats are going to want to crank up the African American vote in smaller, mid-sized cities like Columbus, like Athens, like Augusta, like Savannah, and like Albany, for that matter, which is
Yeah.
the home of representative, the African American representative for the second district.
Just wanted to touch on this real quick. I was separating them just in terms of how I was describing them because Philip's question was just about mail-ins. But I believe when Kraz did our analysis, he does combine them, and obviously respected models, even though our ratings disagree with them, like Nate Cohn's model does actually combine them too. But I agree with you 100%, Oscar. I think they should be combined more because essentially they're one and the same thing. How would you rate the 2022 Senate race based on the outcome? So again, we're going to hopefully leave the end of this. I'll briefly talk about, I'm head of the elections team, so I'll talk about our plans for 2021 and 2022. Obviously no rating yet, but I'd say it's a good sign if both our lean R ratings hold up, then that's probably a good sign that we'd have a similar rating in 2022, especially if the environment in 2022 ends up favoring Republicans, like a lot of us have expected in both parties. But again, I'd say it's too early. If Warnock wins, that's impressive, and that would definitely support the stuff we've seen with things like the Nate Cohn model. But again, I would just say it's too early at this point to look at 2022 since we're focused on wrapping up this election cycle and moving into 2021. But that is a very interesting question, and we'll have more on the 2022 races as we get into the summer months and into the fall once we start to see how the 2022 congressional maps are shaping up, and along with that as well, once we start to see some of the Senate candidates begin their campaigns, and this is just the ones we haven't seen already.
Yeah, I would agree with that as well. It is too early to talk about a lot of these races. One thing I would like to mention, though, is that Republicans, regardless of the result, I do believe the race in Georgia next cycle, involving whether or not the winner of whether it's Warnock or whether it's Loeffler, it will be heavily contested. Obviously, the quality depends on either of the two candidates. I think it's safe to say that both Warnock and Loeffler are the weaker of the two candidates this time around. So either one of them would have a harder time in a runoff election than someone like a Perdue or an Ossoff would, I would think.
Quick,
I do want to mention someone here. I want to bring this up because someone mentioned this. Why no super chat? I want to donate to Elections Daily. If you want to do that, we have an option on our website to do that. We don't talk about it a lot because we're not after donations. But if you wanted to, you can go to our website. We don't have super chat because YouTube literally does not allow you to have super chat until you have a certain number of subscribers. If I'm recalling right, I think you need around 1,000 or so.
Let me link it in the comments, and then there's a link called the affiliate link, and on the homepage you can donate there.
Yeah, but we can't do that until we have a certain number of subscribers. Until you get around 1,000, we're pretty limited in terms of what we can do. I just figured I'd get that out of the way because someone mentioned this. If you wanted to do that, that's fine. Go ahead. If not, no pressure. We're not really after that right now. But I figured I would mention that at least since someone was kind enough to say that.
Yeah. So let me keep going addressing. We're going to try and go through some of these questions a bit quicker now, so because we have quite a few. So real quick, and clarify me if I'm wrong, Brian, but I think you're trying to say, do you think lagging turnout in terms of rural Democratic turnout, like rural Black turnout, is going to hurt Democrats? Eric, do you want to take that one?
Yeah. So based on what we're talking about here, lagging turnout in Democratic areas, right now, Democrats are relying on Atlanta a whole lot, and throughout the state, they're declining gradually in the more rural portions, the southern portion of the state. So obviously, if their turnout is huge in Atlanta and they're winning, Cobb and Gwinnett County by massive margins, then they're in a decent situation. But that could only withstand right now some degree of slipping in the south of the state, which is why having someone like Warnock on the ticket who can appeal to rural African-American voters will be pretty important to them. I would be surprised if this is the factor that tips the election. I would think it would be more likely that Republicans win over some of those voters that backed Joe Biden from the Atlanta metro. But this is definitely a possible scenario here. We've seen a lot of this throughout the country where rural southern areas that are even diverse like in North Carolina or in places like Mississippi, were more willing to vote for a Republican candidate at this point. So that's definitely something to be concerned about in terms of both raw volume and a percentage. But these areas are fairly small in comparison to Atlanta, which has well over half the population of the state reside within the area.
Real quick, I have a question here. How significant will the Libertarian vote be? And this obviously, he knows that the runoff is just between the top two, but what he's saying here is how significant will the Libertarian voters be this time around? Who will they break to? So this is a really interesting question. So the ones that end up going to vote, not all Libertarians are just automatic throw-ins to the Republican column. So we can expect some of the Libertarian vote to go to the Democrats. But I will say usually in elections, the Libertarian vote hurts Republicans. Usually.
Yeah. That's the general assumption, although there are cases where it could have hurt. I've heard that's talked about 2014 in North Carolina, that the Libertarian candidate Sean Haw, who was heavily touted by Democrats who wanted him to kind of take away votes from Tom Tillis, from Republicans who may have been skeptical about him, he may have actually taken more votes away from Kay Hagan. So it's definitely not unheard of.
I'm not saying that it always mostly hurts Republicans. Libertarians vote for Democrats too. There are different types of libertarians within the ideological spectrum of libertarianism. But I would say a 60-40 split for now it's possible. But again, something like measuring the libertarian vote, given the fact that it really was such a small portion of the overall electorate back in November, it's kind of something that we can't really do. We don't really know. So we'll just have to see. Afterwards, I guess we could see where the Libertarian performed best in the state and then attribute it to how it swung from the November election to now. But we're going to have to wait on more election data afterwards for that. But really good question about the Libertarian vote. Let me see.
Yeah. Here's an interesting question that I want from Alec Holbeck. If Atlanta and suburban support for Democrats snap back to pre-Trump levels, not saying that's likely, what should Democrats conclude from that, and what should their ongoing strategy in Georgia be? So I would be surprised if these areas snap back Republican. Places like Gwinnett County are rapidly growing and diverse. They're not exactly Gwinnett is actually a majority-minority county, and the 7th district is a majority-minority district at this point. So I would be surprised if that flips back. Of the two counties that are there, Cobb would be the one that I would see as more likely. It's wider. It has more actual Republican rural trending areas or exurban areas. If Democrats were to hypothetically, though, go back to the floor, they're losing Gwinnett and Cobb counties. They don't really have a lot of good options throughout the state. They got Augusta, they got Savannah, two Democratic cities. They've got places like Columbus, Macon, Georgia, Albany, but they're actually really declining in these areas that are more rural and in southern Georgia. Now, the good thing for Democrats is that those areas are dying, literally. The population is declining in these areas rapidly while it's growing in the Atlanta area. So even if Republicans kept making gains in those areas, it might not actually be enough to secure them a long-term future.
Look at the trend in these suburban counties, even a reliably Republican county like Forsyth County. Biden was the first Democratic nominee for president to get over 30% there. I mean, you're talking about Obama had about 18% there, probably less than that. I mean, Clinton getting 23-ish% in 2016 was big. So the Atlanta area overall, at least now, it's a very, very good question. I'm not knocking that. And I know you said it's not likely, but unfortunately for the Republicans going forward, it doesn't look likely. And Atlanta is really going to be the drag on Republicans in Georgia over the next decade.
Their hope to remain relevant there is to rely on, in the short term, those rural areas and gains with African Americans or white voters in rural areas, and then hope they can figure some way to win Atlanta back within 10 years, because otherwise it's hard to see them having a future in Georgia.
Yeah, so we're going to go through the final questions that we're getting on Georgia and then briefly talk about our plan for our coverage on Georgia for I'll talk about that for a little second, and then we'll be able to go looking at the elections in 2021 and 2022, and you could ask any questions. But I just wanted to address Philip's question. When the state board receives these mail-in ballots, they're going to determine whether or not they're accepted or rejected, valid or invalid, essentially. And I don't know the specifics of it, but I would assume that we are going to hear from the mail-in ballots first, right after the election polls close. And then afterwards, they're going to spend time tabulating the votes that will essentially decide the election if it's really close. And those votes are going to be the ones that we expect to break positively for the Republicans and on the election day vote. Which county are you looking at most on election night? So this is really an interesting one. I would say what we're going to do on election night is break the state into regions, because we already kind of know which regions of Georgia are already most impacted by strong Democratic turnout and early voting. But we're going to break the state into regions more so we can track how election day votes as they're counted are going to impact the election. So I would say we're going to break it up into regions like the Northwest, the Northeast part of Georgia, because we've seen low turnout for Republicans so far, particularly in the Northwest, but also the coastal region, obviously Atlanta Metro, the Atlanta suburbs, kind of like the collar counties north of Atlanta, if you will. So I think I wouldn't say we're looking at a specific county. I'd say we're looking at everything from rural red to solid urban Democratic. Pretty much everything around the state will be important to decide.
I mean, right now, Georgia's kind of a Thanos state. It's kind of perfectly balanced in a lot of ways.
Okay, don't take this the wrong way, but is it possible to do a signature audit in these runoffs? I mean, it's going to be interesting to see. I mean, I think if the runoffs end up being very, very close, especially if they break toward the Democrats, or arguably either way, you're going to see pressure being brought up that we've seen similarly to the pressure we've seen around the presidential contest in Georgia. It's going to be chaotic. I wouldn't say that no one's going to basically what I'm trying to say is the opposite side, the one that comes out on the bottom in terms of these runoffs, is going to be critical of something. So I honestly, I mean, that's a question we'll save for after the election, after we see how it goes. But either we're going to have either side win by at least a comfortable margin, or it's going to be a razor thin margin like we saw Biden's win in Georgia during the presidential contest. So,
and keep in mind that signature verification,
like Cone, for example, if Cone's model is correct and there is a D+13 early advantage lead, then the Republicans probably won't overcome that, and that would back up some of the other modeling, and you'd see like a Democratic win of 3 points or so.
And keep in mind that from my understanding of the signature verification, that happens when the ballots are counted. They're in the envelope, and then you check the signature against the signature on the ballot, and then you discard them, because one of the principles of our elections is that it's a secret ballot, that nobody knows where they are, that people don't know who voted for who. I think it would be very concerning if we all of a sudden we started not only keeping track of we started keeping track of this and then have a vault of votes where you can just look back and see who voted for which candidate. I think that's terrifying, and that's part of the reason why this stuff isn't kept. That this is done initially, that we maybe do that at first or when they're counted, but then we get rid of them because you shouldn't be able to find out who someone voted for.
Yeah.
That's just a fundamental principle of our democracy that's non-negotiable.
So to our audience that's still with us, if you have any final questions about the actual Georgia runoffs in terms of our rating or anything like that, please put them below. I wanted to quickly do this. Do you believe Democrats will flip back rural counties with substantial African-American populations like Burke, Baker, Wilkes that have shifted rightward recently? Again, we're going to have to see. It depends. I honestly don't know. We're going to have to wait and see how the election day vote impacts the early vote. Because there is an argument that some have made that Warnock will energize African-American voters more than someone like John Ossoff. But at the end of the day, African-American voters, even in rural areas, may just be inclined to turn out to vote to get a Democratic Senate majority and vote for both parties. So that's mostly why I think that polarization has played such a role, that there probably won't be a split in the race. There will be a deviation in terms of the margins between the two, whether it be minor or quite large, but I highly doubt there will be a split. These races are either going to go for the Republicans both or for the Democrats both. I don't think a split's particularly likely. And in terms of flips, Eric, do you have anything else to add?
No, I don't think I have anything else to add. That's a pretty good summary, I think.
All right, and let me just see. Oh, okay, this was the last one, I think. The minority vote saw shifts to Trump in November, despite the higher African-American share of early vote. What's the possibility of that replicating again on Tuesday? So two things. It's going to be difficult to say, and I know I've said that a lot, but really this election is going to be thrown into limbo because A, it's a runoff. It's a runoff like we've never seen before in Georgia. We don't really know how many voters will turn out on election day. I mean, we kind of have a guess, and we think it's going to be enough to save the Republicans, but we don't have proof of that. And looking at the minority vote shifts that we saw in November, we have to remember that there are like 150,000 new voters that have never voted before, at least not in the last November election, that have voted this time. And again, there's a higher propensity of them to be in the southern portions of the Atlanta metro, which are home to higher African-American populations. So I'm not sure if you want to add anything to this, Eric, but this sounds like another thing that we won't really know for sure until after the election.
Yeah, I would say that again. One other factor I do want to mention here, which I think is kind of left out of this discourse about Trump winning minority votes. To be fair, he absolutely did better with minority votes than a lot of other Republicans. But one undeniable factor you have to focus on when looking at these areas is the population decline. A lot of them have seen the population, which is predominantly older and predominantly African American, sadly dying off of old age. And that's, I mean, some of the gains there are due to genuine minority outreach. Other parts of it are just natural population loss, and the population that's left is just whiter, and so it's more Republican. And as people get older, there'll be more white voters there than black voters. So part of it is due to that. So I wouldn't be surprised if something like that happened. But like Harrison said, a lot of this is coming from the South Atlanta area. It's not coming from places like Albany or Macon or Columbus, and it's not some.
And if we're looking at, we want to include this as well. This ties into Evan's question earlier of rural black voters as well. We don't really know about the turnout for rural black voters, at least now, because it hasn't been broken down enough. I'm not an expert enough on it to tell you reliably how rural black turnout is comparing against urban black turnout, other than it's lower so far. And maybe they'll be higher on election day, but we'll have to wait and see. There is an urban-rural divide on the effectiveness of voting before the election or on election day. So that's something we'll have to wait and look at. But I guess we'll move on now from the question period, and we'll get close to wrapping up. So we'll just describe how our coverage is going to work. So on Tuesday, it's going to start at 7 p.m. Eastern with our normal panel from the general election. We're going to do about an hour preview show, and then the polls close at 8. We'll be with you all night until, not all night, but until essentially around midnight-ish, to see if there's an outcome or there's a call we can make. We make projections by committee among our staff team and take advice from our election team. And we'll have that, essentially the result there. And if it drags out over the coming days or a week, then we'll be with you each day with updates about the race, and after that with analysis. But then, thankfully, this election cycle will be over and we'll be able to move on. And in 2021, we're going to introduce a new politics podcast complete with a newsletter. We're also going to be working on Virginia ratings, and Joe Szymanski's running that, working with some other partners, and I'm running the New Jersey ratings, and we're going to be rating the governor's race in both chambers of our state legislature here with Ethan Chen and Ben Kestenbaum. So those are there, and then same thing in Virginia. Like I said, the legislature and the governorship are going to be rated, along with other row offices like lieutenant governor and attorney general. And then after that, towards the end, we'll work our way into the 2022 cycle. And the only real change from 2020 is that all our ratings will be done by committee versus the division strategy that we used previously.
Yeah. And one thing I do want to note is that we have additional projects that we've not talked about publicly yet because we're still working on them. We have two major projects which are going to be very, very cool. I think election Twitter and politics followers in general are going to love them. One of them comes from the heart of election Twitter, and the other is a project internally that we're working on that I think we're really excited about. So keep an eye on those in the coming months, where we're hopefully going to be able to unveil both of them.
All right. So that concludes our Georgia stream. So we'll be back with you on Tuesday. We hope this helped, and good night, everyone.
Yeah. Thanks for coming on.